Hello, welcome to Numeristical. If you've been following our channel, then you know that our betting model has been getting pretty bad results so far. We are down 11 units after only a few weeks, and I think it's natural to ask at this point, is this just bad luck? Is this evidence that the model is not working, that something's wrong with it? And so I wanted to do this analysis, and both for myself and also to share with you folks how I would go about approaching this in a really unbiased mathematical way to try to get at the answer of, is this bad luck? Is this the model not being as good as we think it is, or somewhere in between? And this ends up being quite a subtle and complicated question to answer. So I wanted to share my process and walk through it with you. So let's get into it. I've put together a notebook here I call performance evaluation, and the gist of it is just, well, it's not doing well so far, but it's still very early. It's still a pretty small sample size. So to what extent do we want to just say, hey, it's bad luck, let's just keep going, stay on target, and to what extent can we say, hey, maybe this means the model isn't working or something has changed or something else is off, that what we expected to happen is not happening. How much evidence do we have for that? So I wanted to walk through how I do this analysis. So the first thing we're going to do is load in all the bets. So this is that Google sheet that I usually share at the beginning of each one. And I've just put it all into a nice CSV. I've taken out the rain out games and the game for today because we don't have a result on that one yet. And I've just made a little number here, 0 or 1 for win or loss, and sometimes I put a little ouch next to the loss, so I just want to clean that up. And I've got the profit and loss and the odds of all of our bets. So next, I want to separate this out into the totals versus the money line. So there's two, pretty different models, the totals and the money line. And I think it makes sense to look at the results of each of them separately. So I'm going to just separate those out. So if you look, we had 44 bets overall. Let me do something real quick. Just doing something so you can see my cursor. So now you can see my cursor. So got 44 bets total. 11 of them are on totals and 33 on the money line. And if you look at the totals model, it's only 11 bets. We're actually 6 and 5, and we're up 0.26 units. So that model, there's really not that much to say. It's slightly above. You can't say it's doing any better or worse than expected. It's probably about what we would expect. So the real action, so to speak, has been at the money line. And if we look at the money line, you see that we've made 33 bets and we've only won 10 and we've lost 23. So that's quite bad. And we've lost, as a consequence, about 11.4 units on this. So this is where we're going to focus our attention is on this money line model. And to sort of address these questions, the first thing we need to do is do a lot of background and clarify what we mean by all these different probabilities that we talk about. And also to clarify my process of how I take the model and turn the model into decisions and what I expect from those decisions to happen. So we've got a bunch of probabilities to consider. The first one I want to think about is the betting line probability. So this is the implied probability of the bet that you placed. So put another way, if the true probability of the event is the betting line probability, then the bet will have 0 expected value. You should break even in the long run. If the true probability of the event is greater than the betting line probability, you should make money in the long run. And if the true probability is less than the betting line probability, you should lose money in the long run. So that's the betting line. That's the line that you bet at. That's what we put in this data frame we have here. Another probability to consider, though, is what I call the bookmaker belief probability. So this is kind of what the bookmaker thinks the real probability is. So if they're letting you bet at, 55%, an implied probability of 55%, it's because they think the real probability is less than that. They probably think the real probability is 52 or 53%, and they're saying, well, we think this is only going to happen 52 or 53% of the time. So we'll let people bet as if it's going to happen 55% of the time, and we'll make money on the difference. And this way, even if we're off by a little bit, if the true probability is really 54%, but we're only letting people bet at 55%, we'll still make money. And so we'd have to be off by a little bit. So this is the VIG, what they call the VIG, that difference. And this is both how the bookies sort of make money and also protect themselves from losing money, is by baking in this VIG, this difference between what they think the real probability is and the probability that they'll let you bet that event on. Next, we want to talk about the model probability. So this is the numbers that come out of my machine learning model. And one important thing to note is that I don't expect these model probabilities to be right. So in particular, overall, they're pretty well calibrated, but what you do notice is that when the model probability is distinctly different from, say, both the bookmaker probability and the betting line probability, when there's a big difference there, the bets in the back testing, I saw that these bets had positive expected value, but they did not have as much expected value as the model thinks they would. So, and I'll walk through an example there to illustrate that. But what I want to say now is that there's another concept I want to bring up, which is like sort of this adjusted model probability. So this is what I kind of expect to happen when I place a bet. So what happens is there's a betting line, there's the bookmaker has their probability, there's a gap between that and what you can bet at. Then I require a certain gap between that and what my model thinks it is. And what I really expect is for the truth to sort of come in somewhere in between there. And so it's somewhere in that money-making region, but it's probably not going to make as much money as the model thinks it is. But it's going to make more than the zero that I would get if it's exactly the betting line probability. So let's walk through an example. Let's pick a game, and the bookie thinks, they've set the over-under line, and they think this is a 50-50 bet the way I've got it set. It's exactly 50-50. So their probability, the bookmaker belief probability, would be 0.5. So now they're a bookie, they're trying to make money, so they put some edge in there. They say, okay, I'm setting the line at minus 110. So you got to bet 11 to make 10. So what that means is if you're betting this consistently, you have to be right 52.4% of the time to break even. So you've really got to be more than that. You got to be like, have a higher probability than that of being right in order to actually make money. So now how does my model come in? Let's say my model looks at a bunch of these events and it says, here's one. The betting line probability is 52.4 because it's at minus 110. But my model actually thinks it's 0.6. So there's an edge there of 0.076. It's between 60% that my model thinks it's going to happen and the 52.4 that I can bet at. Now what happens is when I was developing these models and testing them against the odds and so forth, what I found was that if I set this edge, I tried different edges. How big do I want that edge to be between my model probability and the betting line probability? I looked across a range of edges to see where did I maximize my profit. And, let's say, for the sake of argument, let's say it was around 0.07 for this particular model. So let's recap. The bookmaker really thinks it's a 50-50 bet. They're saying, okay, I'll let you place a bet so that if you win 52.4% of the time, you're going to break even. If you win more than that, you're going to make money. My model said, I think it's going to happen 60% of the time. And I looked at it and said, wow, that edge is big. And from the back testing, when I have an edge that big, I make money. And on average, let's say across that big set of bets, I saw that I made about 3%. So I didn't make as much as the model thought I would make, but I made more than the zero or negative that I would get if it was at the betting line or closer to the bookmaker's odds, bookmaker belief probability. So when my model says 0.6 and the betting line probability is 52.4, I personally think I'm probably going to win 55% of the time, 55.4, let's say. Because it was roughly about 3% is what I saw in back testing on this whole set of bets that cleared that threshold. So a lot there. Let me just try to summarize it really shortly. Most of the time, the model and the bookmaker more or less agree on the probability. For most of the games, the model will be pretty close to what the bookmaker thinks, and therefore when you take the bookmaker plus the VIG, it doesn't make sense to bet. Now when there's a really big discrepancy between the model and the betting line, which implies a big difference between, an even bigger difference between the model and the bookmaker's probability, what you find is the truth is usually somewhere in the middle. It's not that the model is right and they totally discard the bookmaker. It's that the answer is somewhere in the middle, but in the middle is still far enough on the good side of the betting line to make money. So that's a really important thing. I've had questions saying, why do you need an edge? Why don't you just bet if the edge is just a little bit? Well, because I don't think my model has everything. One way to think about it is, my model probably has some information or analysis or some more precise crunching of the numbers than the bookies do. But then the bookies also probably have some other information and stuff that's not incorporated into my model. And so most of the time they align, those differences are small. When there's a big difference, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. If there's a really big difference, then even just being in the middle is good enough to make money. Now, if given both my model's number and the bookie's number, you'd really go with the bookie's number, you'd barely adjust my number, then the model is not going to add any value. Okay, so how does this getting back to evaluating the model, how do I use this to evaluate the model? Well, again, I'm saying the expected edge I have, given that my bet has cleared this threshold, is about 0.3%. This is the edge over the betting line, which already includes the VIG, which is the difference between the bookmaker's head and the line they let you bet at. So the VIG estimate, I put at 0.024. That's the standard when it's a 50-50 bet and you bet at minus 110. That's kind of the standard VIG. Might vary a little bit, and you could quibble with this number to some degree, and it would be more problematic if we had a lot of bets that were far from 50-50. I was betting a lot of things at like 10 to 1 or 20 to 1, then that big estimate, you might want to do something a little better. But for this process, I think it's good enough because most of our bets are pretty darn close to 50-50. And so we're going to just convert some of these lines to probabilities and compute these different probabilities. So I'm going to compute what I call the betting line probability. That's just converting the odds into a probability, the betting line. And then I'm going to add the edge to get sort of what I think my personal probability is for what I expect it to happen. And then we're going to subtract out the estimate of the VIG to get what the bookie probably thought would happen. So let's do that. So again, just to break this down, let's take the first game, the Blue Jays and the Rays. The odds were negative 126. That means you could bet on the game as if the Rays were going to win 55.75% of the time. So if you made this bet and the Rays were going to win exactly 55.75% of the time, you'd break even. What that means, backing out, is the bookie probably thought the Rays were going to win about 53.3% of the time, and then they baked in a little bit of the edge to say, well, this way if we let people bet at 55.7%, we'll make some money. And what happened was my model, I don't have my model numbers here, but my model was big enough to clear the threshold between the betting line probability plus some edge. And what that means for me is that I think probably it's around 58.7%. That's what I would expect. to be true in this situation from my back testing and my experience with the model. So what we're really interested in is which is more right, this bookie probability or this adjusted model probability. And how much more right is one than the other. So let's try to scroll down and take a look at that. So first, a couple simple analyses. First is if you look at the mean of these numbers, you see that we won 30% of the bets. According to the model, the adjusted model, I would have kind of expected that we were going to win 48.4% of these bets. And the bookie probably expected that we were going to win about 43% of the bets. And we actually won 30%. So even the bookie, we're winning far less than even the bookie expected us to, is the gist here. And if you want to know sort of, okay, how unlucky is this? This is 10 out of 33. It's a pretty small sample size. So what's the probability of getting 10 or less heads if you flipped a coin with 43% heads 33 times? So that's kind of saying, what would the bookie think in terms of how unlucky we've been, right? And then next, what would the model think? If actually the coin was 48%, what would the model think? And these are a little bit rough. These are actually going to be, we're actually more unlucky than this suggests due to some mathematical stuff I don't want to get into. But these give a rough estimate. And what this is saying is, if you look at it, is according to the bookie's probabilities, even the bookie was totally right, and their probabilities were spot on, and we were flipping coins just that had exactly the probabilities that the bookie thought they were. We were in the bottom 10% of outcomes. So that's bad. It's not like horribly, unimaginably bad, but yeah, it's kind of bad, bottom 10%. And if you look at how bad are we doing compared to like what the model thought, it would say we're in like the bottom 3%. So that's sort of even more unlucky, right? It's saying like, yeah, 1 out of 30 or so, even less than that, 1 out of 30, 1 out of 40, something like that. Okay. So this is just to say we're definitely unlucky. We've definitely been unlucky so far. Now, so from the numbers alone, we won 30%. Using the bookies would have expected us to win 43%. We expect to win 48.4% of the bets. So we've definitely been unlucky. But this doesn't mean that like, okay, give up now. I know I've been unlucky. I can just stop here. Because these poor results are more likely in the world where the model has no predictive power than in the world where the model is 3% better than the betting line. And you saw that in the above calculation, and we're going to kind of revisit that again a little more precisely. So the question is, how strong is the evidence against the model? Because certainly this bad luck still means it's more like, would happen more often. This bad luck happens more often in a world where the bookie is right and we're wrong versus in the world where we're right and the bookie is wrong. So let's consider these two scenarios. The first scenario we'll call scenario 1. This means that the bookie probability is right. If you ignore the model is just doing nonsense, and kind of say, what's the probability of all the stuff we've seen so far under that scenario? And then we could say, scenario 2, no, our adjusted model probability is right. That's the correct compromise. So remember, I said this adjusted model probability is sort of a compromise between the model's number and the bookmaker's number. And this is sort of where I've guesstimated it to be. And let's see what's the likelihood of the data under that scenario. And we could compute these likelihoods and see how much to a likelihood ratio, how much more likely is the data under scenario 1 versus scenario 2. And this will tell us the strength of the evidence of scenario 1 versus scenario 2. So first thing I'm going to do is just compute the likelihoods. So again, let's look at this first game. Let's just look at the model and bookie probabilities. So the model said this should happen. Rays should win 58.7% of the time. The bookie thought they'd only win 53.35% of the time. They, in fact, lost. So what's the likelihood of that event under each model? Well, the bookie thought the Rays were going to win 53% of the time, so I thought they were going to lose 46.6% of the time. My model thought the Rays were going to lose only 41.2% of the time. So these last two columns tell us the likelihoods. That's like the probability of what actually happened according to these two different models. And here you see them for all the games. And so you could just compute these likelihoods, and it's very small numbers that you don't even have to deal with logs or anything like that. You could just compute the likelihoods, and you see that the likelihood of the bookie's probabilities, likelihood under scenario 1, is 8.49 to the power negative 10, and under the model, this adjusted model probability, it's 2.76, and the ratio is about 3. So what does that mean? This data is 3 times more likely to happen under scenario 1 than it is under scenario 2. So what does that mean? How strong is that evidence? 3 times more likely. Well, it means that if you started out and you're saying, hey, I don't know who you are, you might have something, you might not. I think it's 50-50. I think it's a coin, totally 50-50. I'm totally agnostic. You might be right, you might be wrong. I'm starting in thinking it's equally likely that your model is totally worthless and just flipping coins, and that you have, or that you're right and you actually have the edge that you think you have. So if you started out thinking 50-50 and you got this evidence, because it's 3 to 1, the evidence is 3 to 1 in favor of scenario 1, that would mean that you should now think it's 75% likely that the model is kind of worthless and 25% that the model has some value. If you came in thinking 50-50, your updated belief would be 75% for scenario 1, 25% for scenario 2. If you came in thinking, let's say it was 90% chance that scenario 2 was correct, so you know me, you're pretty confident I knew what I was doing, pretty confident I didn't make any mistakes. This is probably about what I think. I probably came in like 80-90%. I'm not like super duper sure that this was going to work, but pretty sure it was going to work. So if I started out, let's say 90%, because it makes the math nice, now I should only be down to 75%. So that makes me feel a little better. So I can sleep a little better at night saying, okay, if I came in 95%, it still should be like, I'm pretty sure it works. My confidence is a little bit shaky. I'm a little bit less confident about it. But I shouldn't be ready to be like, oh my God, this is definitely wrong. I need to, reevaluate everything. And I still am looking over everything and making sure I didn't make any mistakes, making sure I didn't, a possible source of errors. There are lots of sources of error that come in when you take something from just running on static historical data to live data. One example, for example, is the lineups. So that's one discrepancy. In the past, I know exactly what the lineup is. I have the lineup. And the way I'm operating now, I don't know the lineup for sure. I'm grabbing it from at the beginning. It was much more kind of guesswork. I'm grabbing it from certain sources, which some of which are more reliable than others. So all that adds a little bit of uncertainty. But I think there's a really useful analysis to do if you're in this sort of situation. Is really just kind of say, okay, here's 2 scenarios. One. And then just compute the likelihood of just those 2 scenarios and see how that plays out. One technical note, so here I just computed the likelihoods directly. I just took the products, and you can see these numbers are starting to get small. It's 10 to the negative 10th. And that's why you use logs. So the more standard way to do this is to just you take the log of the likelihood and you add them, because adding logs is the same as multiplying the probabilities, and then you take the exponent of the difference. So this is just to show you get the exact same number if you were to take the logs, take logs of all those likelihoods, add them up, subtract the 2 numbers rather than dividing them, and then exponentiate the difference. And then also to show how this is tied to log loss. So log loss is a metric many of you work with. It's what I use to train the models and so forth. And when you do use the log loss, you don't actually need to those likelihood columns that I sort of manually created. It's baked into calculating the log loss. So you would just calculate the log losses between the two models. Then take the difference. You'd have to multiply it by the number of bets because the log loss divides that out, and then exponentiate that, and you get the same number. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was useful. I hope that encourages people to keep following and not lose faith in me just yet. It certainly made me feel a little better, so I'm glad I did it. So thanks for joining me. I hope you'll continue to watch, and have a great day.